On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Kyle Randolph. He is the CISO at Optimizely. We're going to cover a few different areas during the course of our discussion. We're going to focus on bootstrapping software security programs, what has been changed over the last couple of years. We're going to kind of examine 5-10 years ago's needs versus today, and how does security partner with engineering teams, DevOps, SRE teams, and going to get all his insight. And I'm super excited to have him on as a guest. Thanks, Kyle.
Hey, thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely. So kind of give our audience a chance to get to know you and put a little context to the conversation. Can you give us a quick intro of who you are, what you do, and we'll kind of go from there?
Yeah, I've been doing software security my whole career, about 18 years now. Started out at Citrix, and so enterprise software, then clients, remote desktops. Joined as a software engineer out of boredom, found ways to get local system access on Windows 2000 servers, and became a security team of one way back then. Went over to Adobe when Adobe was in the news a lot for a great way to get malware on people's computers, send them a PDF or a flash file. So helped clean that up, get Adobe Acrobat Reader and Flash Player into sandboxes right around the time Chrome introduced the notion of sandbox processes. Over to Twitter, when Twitter was scaling up to become a big public company. And the most interesting challenge there was the thousands and thousands of people getting their accounts compromised every day, mainly through credential stuffing attacks, other things tied to weak passwords. So how do you reduce account compromise at massive scale? That was really interesting. And then finally over to Optimizely. Been here 6 years, joined when they were a small startup, and joined to build everything out from scratch for security, and then later on privacy and compliance. So scaled up a software security team as well as security partnerships throughout the organization.
You've definitely had a tour of challenges, it seems like, from every stop. And I'm gonna ask you about bootstrapping security program, because obviously Optimizely was a different type of organization. But just out of curiosity, like, it seems like every place you've gone, Adobe, obviously in a very interesting situation with Flash and Chrome, and Apple deciding different fates for Flash itself. And then obviously to Twitter, earlier days, security, probably an evolving program. Has anything in particular shaped your philosophy of how you approach security? Because you go back to your Citrix days. That's a really early exposure to, I guess, a different type of security program altogether.
Yeah, I guess one thing I've learned throughout all this time, even with things changing, is that the more you can take these security decisions out of the hands of the developers, the better, and the more they can get security for free and not have to think about security or figure out security on their own, the better. So building more security into frameworks and libraries and standards is a great way to grow security, as opposed to like trying to get everybody to act as a security expert.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess, when you went to Optimizely, just for context, it's been 6 years. How big was the organization when you first started?
Right after their Series B, I think there were under 200 people, and the engineering organization was a couple dozen engineers. And at the time, they were getting a lot of security for free because they had a monolith running on Google App Engine. So Google Cloud Platform took care of a lot of security for them. And that was good enough for a startup just getting started. But then as they grew larger, and the risk of the data they were collecting, as well as the JavaScript they were serving on customers' websites to do A/B testing, grew. The bar got raised significantly for security. And then also as the deal sizes for the customers grew, when it moved off of just like one person signing up their credit card on a website to where you were doing a deal with Fortune 500 company, they don't sign that 6 or 7 figure check without giving you a lot of security scrutiny. So we had to step up.
I think most CISOs that I've talked to, especially work at a SaaS type company and going through the startup phase and maturing as an organization, it seems that when the larger B2B type transactions start kicking in, that's when security goes to the top of the heap in terms of prioritization. And obviously, you want the bigger deal size, you want to be in the bigger organizations, that becomes a requirement. Most people are not really addressing that because obviously the startups moving a million miles an hour. Like, do you personally feel you've gone through a lot of different experiences. Is that pretty much just what typically happens because of inertia, or what are your thoughts around that?
It's a trade-off in the early days. Like I would say, like when you're first starting off, again, like a lot of security for free from the platforms you're building on. Then kind of in between there, you have the liberty to like focus on the top risks of the company, like independent of any customer expectations or compliance requirements or anything, which is really nice. And so you can be very surgical with where you focus your efforts. But then when the customers come along and they start looking at your security, like they have no idea if you're secure or not. They have no idea how surgical you're being with your risk management. And they don't have a security measuring stick. So instead, they're just going to send you questionnaires asking you everything under the sun about your security. And you may not want to do all of these things that they're asking you to do. They may not make you any more secure, but they don't have a better way of measuring. So they look for that. They may look for compliance as another like proxy for measuring how secure you are. And unfortunately, it's imperfect, but what they're really looking for is your security program mature enough to not like put me at an unacceptable risk. And since they don't have a good way of measuring security maturity, they look at these other methods.
So when you, I guess, kind of tying into bootstrapping a program, you were to optimize like 200 people. You're the first security hire. When you're hired into that role, obviously coming from Adobe, Twitter, you're obviously a manager in both the roles previous to this. When you come in there and you're being hired and they're asking you what you're going to do, the advice, the feedback you're providing, how does this company of that size digesting that? Because obviously they're looking at the strategic bigger picture, but also, oh man, this is going to change things.
Yeah, we were very clear up front, like, hey, the best way to like get a lot of security fast would be like coming in as an individual contributor. Yeah, like could be a manager, could scale up a team from the start, but like just to get the ball rolling, it would be much more effective to have one very, very highly leveraged subject matter expert building partnerships throughout the organization. And so it was like a clear plan from the beginning. Hey, I'm going to join as an individual contributor and then scale up a team when the time is right. And that was good because just starting out, like there was no process to hook on to. It was like agile, but without Scrum or anything. So it was all about like word of mouth and kind of like inbound marketing, like developing relationships. So people were bringing security questions to me, and then I had liberty to go poke around in whatever I wanted in the infrastructure to just sniff out what I figured was top concerns for me that would be a problem. And then I could just walk across the floor to find the engineer who could fix it right there. It was the opposite of like process. It was just like a lot of like, let's just grow things very tactically and very precise on particular areas that were problems. But then as the organization gets bigger, I'd say we got into like over the 50 engineer threshold. And then you're like, the company's also thinking like, okay, engineering organization, now we want to like start getting some predictability in our deploys. Like we've cleaned up our keys, so not everybody has like admin access keys sitting on their laptop. Like we have some deploy automation here. We have some separation of duties. So now like as the company is maturing their engineering processes, that's a good time. Okay, now like let's start maturing security processes as well before we get too far and then have to bolt those on later. Let's start with some inexpensive hooks into the software development process.
I guess as you're getting in there and obviously it's been 6 years and you're kind of progressing through building out the security program, did you notice a shift in terms of the perception of security? Because obviously, maybe we'll talk about, further back in the perception of security and views of, other organizations, but within Optimizely, were you seeing security as becoming more of a partner? Were you seeing, integration into the engineering teams?
Yeah, like starting out, culture was awesome. Like everybody in engineering was really excited about security, wanted to do the right thing. They were maybe not super familiar with software security. They'd gotten tastes of it and wanted to learn more. And they're like, hey, I really want to do this right. Help me do it. And there's a million things they could be doing for security. And I was there to help them figure out like which are the like one or two things they should focus on and screen out the rest until later or never. That went great. And I would say there was a great partnership, security and engineering there. We ran into a tough spot when compliance came along. So customers wanted to see PCI compliance. The issue with PCI compliance is the standard is very prescriptive, and it says you have to do things this way. You have to do your security this PCI way, whether it makes sense for you or not. And our project for building out PCI compliance, it did like increase our security maturity a bit, but it did it in ways we would not have like built our security in that way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put so much like change management process, and we upfront, we wouldn't have had quite so many reviews at that point in time, like formal processes for it. And the issue there was like, how do you message like what we're doing for PCI and for compliance separate from what we're doing for security? It was hard, and a lot of folks like would just mix up the two. Oh, okay, I got to do this security because of compliance, and then it became, oh well, do I have to do this? Well, it must be because of compliance, and then it became, oh man, I have to do something I don't want to do. It must be due to security and compliance, and so that like it tarnished the reputation of security because of the less than ideal things we had to do for compliance. That took some time to refine the messaging on. Had to like beat the drum constantly on like, why is PCI important to the business, and what are we doing? And to be clear, like PCI, just PCI, we do things in a certain way for compliance, but then for security and how we manage risk outside of our PCI environment, that's very different. And that's up to us, and we control our own destiny there. And you just can't over communicate enough to like keep that distinction clear, both like with the broader engineering organization, but also with top level engineering management and midline engineering managers, because they need to also be like echoing these messages constantly as well to clear confusion.
Yeah, what's interesting is the common theme that I hear interviewing security executives is when an organization brings security into place, it's a big shift. When they bring compliance into place, the pain is multiple fold just because it's two competing, I guess, concepts. And there is, compliance is not security. Maybe for security professionals, is something easy to understand. But if you're outside of it, like you've been talking about, you kind of might seeing a bit of a blurred line. I guess when you're looking at it and you're, having to implement, compliance, and you're also focused on security, what's your philosophy? Are you looking at, third party operators and bring the right vendor in? Are you looking for opportunities to build what you can because you want to have it be more custom? So, the requirements are more fulfilled depending on potentially what you're trying to address?
Yeah, the typical security point of view is in the build versus buy analysis. First off, have one. And sometimes with engineering that happens, sometimes engineers want to jump straight to build. Can't police that all the time, but you can encourage that it happens. And then in the build versus buy analysis, typically the security point of view is very biased to buying, because you shift that responsibility of all that security, compliance, privacy, everything onto the vendor, and you can focus on building business value and not on toiling away doing security processes, patch management, network security, things like that. Encouraging like the full set of trade-offs to be made there. Like sometimes there may be build versus buy analyses, but maybe it was done just like with, okay, which one's more cost effective? Like, do we want to use this AWS service to manage our Kubernetes infrastructure? Or do we want to spin up our own Kubernetes cluster, do our own management, and we don't have to pay that like crazy fee for EKS? Okay, like you save the company 5 figures a year, but if you're spending 2 engineers a year costing 300K a piece on maintaining the security and availability of that Kubernetes cluster, like it may not be optimizing for the right things. So it's also about making awareness, hey, like if you are doing a build versus buy analysis, like take a full view of all the trade-offs, not just optimize for 1 or 2 things.
Do you see the shift left that, security is undergoing? Do you see that as just a natural progression of, I guess, seeing what's happened in the DevOps world? And, DevOps has definitely shifted left and seemingly moving further left. And you see security and the discussion of doing a lot more automation, everything as a code, policy as a code. Is that something that you just see as a natural progression of what's happening?
Yeah, I think what's changed with this is like 5 years ago, like if you were like, hey, let's deploy policy as code, and it like will forbid you from deploying something unless like it checks out with its software composition analysis, it's already done a scan, it already like is using particular libraries, or it doesn't talk to the network other than like authorized ports. that kind of like saying no upfront stuff 5 years ago would be shut down. Like, hey, engineers need velocity, they need liberty to do whatever they want, and then we'll use humans, human to human, to bake the security in. But now I believe like folks have seen like the power of open policy agent. Like you can set these policies and block things. You can have like the policy right there rather than like having a security policy or like an AWS or GCP security standard. It's 50 pages long. Engineers aren't going to read it. Maybe they read some of it, they deploy, and then the security team reviews it and still tells them they did it wrong. Nobody likes that. And but the policy, like, hey, like I don't have to go read that document. I can just go look at this policy as code. I satisfy that, and I know if I make it from there into production, then I've satisfied the requirements. No documentation necessary, and it doesn't have to linger on my mind so much that like security is going to come back and tell me I did it wrong half a dozen different ways.
Do you see, I guess, as you're seeing something like policy as a code and on your security engineering team itself, have you seen the mindset shift in terms of, previously maybe people were much more comfortable, we're going to operate, we're going to manage tools versus now I'm thinking more like an engineer potentially?
Yeah, I think one thing there is like we still like shifting this thought of like approaching something first with a document. So first writing a policy in a document and then porting that document over to code. The engineers don't really want to review documents. Yeah, it's Google Docs can be easier to collaborate on for documents, but GitHub, we can do pull requests and we can comment there. And I think one thing I wish we had started doing sooner is like just let's skip the documentation and go straight to writing the policy as code. And that's it. No translation needed later. Because what we found is, we could crank out the documents really fast, but then there would be this gap between like what the document says and what the policy code says. I just ran into one the other day where like it was a tagging policy, and like in the tagging policy document it said like 7 tags are required, but then when I deployed only 3 were required. And then some of the tags that specified in the document, it was like the key is this, and then the value, I think it was for data processed, is a JSON array of the types of data you're processing. Okay, that's fine. But then when I actually tried to deploy it, like I couldn't use the special characters for a JSON array in my tag value. So like we didn't even get to the point of testing that because we were working in a document first as opposed to like getting closer to like the engineering workspace and how they develop and deploy it. Like if we just done this in the policies code and turned it on that same week, we would have gotten this feedback sooner and not had this like discrepancy between what was on a wiki somewhere and what was actually happening in production.
Interesting. And maybe just to stay with this for a second, because I've actually had a few people who are more IC security people reach out, and I always ask for topics for the show. And someone was like, have someone talk about policy as a code. In this case, I think what they're trying to understand is, and maybe you can expand a little bit on this, is if my organization has not moved to policy as a code, they're still traditional. I'm a senior or lead IC, maybe the CISO is not on board. You're saying obviously skipping documentation was a good step, but if you're one step before that, you're like, hey, I want to actually move into a different paradigm. Any advice, since you've kind of undergone it, that somebody who wants to maybe move that direction could use?
Yeah, the approach I find useful for this is one that's useful for a lot of software security, like introducing new things. Start very, very small and something very that you have high confidence. This could be a scanner, or it could be a stack analysis tool, or it could be a policy as code enforcement. Like start with just one rule. That's it. And make sure it's a rule that like you have very high confidence it's not going to give you false positives or miss the mark. Like keep the scope very small on the rule, but get that working end to end in production. And yeah, it's not having much impact yet, but it's one solid foundation and one solid example you can start from. And the sooner you get that in, you can say, hey, this has been in production for 3 months and hasn't caused us problems. That you're like accruing goodwill for it from the start, even though it may be a relatively tiny impact on anything. But once you have one there and you have confidence in it, you can put 2 in. And going 1 to 2, big deal. You may still have a document with 2-3 dozen other requirements that manually have to be applied or applied in some other way. but you just can incrementally put a couple things in here. And then the nice thing about it too is like if your source code is open, other folks can contribute to it. And you may find like I was using these for the security team was using them for security, but maybe an SRE wants to put something in there to make their life easier, especially after they've seen it work and not cause them problems. If they also see value in it and on their own, they're taking initiative to leverage it, then you got like buy-in from other teams, which is really cool. And so you can grow from there after you've built up that good first example.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're trying to champion policy as a code, start small. Are there any particular people that, obviously you see as potential, allies in kind of getting that, started? Is there like maybe you mentioned, maybe working with the DevOps or SRE team who might want to contribute? Is it, also talking about it a little bit more in terms of, hey, this is what I'm trying to do? Because obviously, getting a little bit more buy-in and goodwill is obviously going to help strengthen your case.
Yeah, I think out of all engineering teams, the one that the security teams should make their number one priority for partnership is the SRE or DevOps team. And it's really spending a lot of time on the relationships and developing a high level of trust there. And talking about security goals and SRE goals and finding overlap in them, being very clear and supportive of some of that security infrastructure, or maybe a lot of it, or the vast majority of it, being owned and operated by the DevOps or SRE team. I don't think it's healthy to have a parallel security infrastructure team separate from the SRE team's infrastructure. I do believe it's better for security to be part of the SRE team's charter, and they can own and operate infrastructure that's there for security. They meet security requirements. They're talking to the security team about it. We spend a lot of time on alignment, but you don't need security to actually own and maintain that infrastructure. And that's also really good for the organization because it's much more flexible if you scale up a SRE team and they can work on security one day, scalability the next, availability another, developer productivity another, whatever the business needs. And then your security team can stay focused on security and maximizing the leverage they have in that security subject matter expertise, as opposed to you have 2 of your 4 security engineers spending half their day just keeping the lights on with some security infrastructure.
Awesome. I think that's golden. I think that I'm gonna definitely, once the podcast is live, I'm gonna send the links to a couple of people that pretty much in dialogue ask similar questions, because I think a lot of people see the discussion of shifting left, and then a lot of times it's like, well, my organization hasn't even moved off the dial. How do I start? I mean, that was a really nice blueprint in terms of how someone can start small, get a champion, the partnership with SREs. I guess if you were looking back yourself, maybe previous jobs or just what was happening 5-10 years ago, did you anticipate this bubbling up? I mean, is it something you saw happening in terms of this level of policies and code, everything as a code, partnering with SREs a lot more?
So I think 5 years ago, there was a lot of talk about these things. And Microsoft Security Development Lifecycle, we talked about secure libraries. Folks talked about tooling. Hey, let's get the tooling on sooner. But the quality of the frameworks and tools that you had was pretty limited. So Microsoft example, hey, build security into frameworks. Okay, what are some examples of that? Well, there's a safe string library. All right, that's nice. What else? And maybe you get a web framework serving security headers, but it's a pretty limited set, and it wasn't covering think of 120 different security controls. I would like to have frameworks or libraries or something for. Maybe half a dozen of those tops had that kind of capability at the time. Also, until recently, so tooling. Okay, scanning tools. Scanning tools have really high false positive rates, and so do you really want to shift left and have to make a tool happy if it's noisy and you're full-time job just wading through false positives there? Now you have a lot more options than just static analysis tools. And in fact, I don't think those make sense with a lot of languages in a SaaS company. They make a lot of sense for unmanaged code, C++, maybe something like Python or PHP if you're Facebook. But for a lot of folks, that just you're not going to get value out of those. But yeah, you have these policy tools. You have tools to tell you about the health of your containers. You have software composition analysis. There's a lot more options now. AWS security configuration monitoring, GCP security configuration monitoring. These are the kind of things that where you can really tune and get a lot of value out of them and have like a more comprehensive story of shifting left than you could before.
Awesome, man. I think this has been a fantastic show. I'm hoping whoever ends up listening to it, who is trying to get off the ground, can kind of take these words and apply them. If someone wants to actually reach out to you and might have a follow up question, because obviously we're not we're not getting super deep on any particular subject, but is LinkedIn or Twitter, is there a particular social medium you like somebody to potentially reach out via?
Yeah, LinkedIn or Twitter are fine. Happy to chat with anybody who wants to as follow up.
Awesome. So we'll definitely add those to the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. Great topics we've covered. So that'll be the end of this show. And we'll be back next week. Different guest, different show. And in the meantime, always looking for more ideas. If somebody has a topic they want answered, just like we did today, it definitely trying to help expand the reach of the podcast. So if you can also subscribe or like or whatever you need to do to get us some feedback, good or bad, I'd love to know that. Till next week, we'll be back again. Thanks.